It's not just a personal sin, it's also sort of a political sin. And you create the very machinery that will later be used against you. And that's exactly what happened.
Welcome to Acton Line, a product of the Acton Institute for the Study of Religion and Liberty. I'm Eric Cohn, executive producer. In this episode, Dr. John Pinheiro speaks with Dr. Joseph Stuart, associate professor of history and fellow in Catholic Studies at the University of Mary in Bismarck, North Dakota, about the complexity of the European Enlightenments, namely the most common misconceptions and the mistake made by Christian and secular scholars alike, who see the Enlightenment only as a simplistic conflict between faith and reason. Stuart argues that Christians interacted with the Enlightenments by using one of three strategies: conflict, engagement, or retreat. Along the way, Dr. Pinheiro and Dr. Stuart uncover interesting tales of a Catholic Enlightenment in Italy, consider the connection between an authentic human anthropology and genuine liberty, and draw lessons about the unintended consequences of integral Catholic states. You can find additional resources in the show notes for this episode, as well as find previous episodes of Acton Line on our website at acton.org/actonline. And if you like this program, you can help us reach even more listeners by sharing it with a friend and leaving us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. We welcome your comments as well. Acton Line is available on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen.
This is Dr. John Pinheiro, Director of Research at Acton Institute, and it's my pleasure today to welcome Dr. Joseph Stuart. We're going to spend some time with Dr. Stuart talking about the Enlightenment, but first let me tell you a little bit of something about him. Dr. Stuart is, I'd say, a newly minted professor of history, having been associate professor of history when we arranged this interview, now professor and chair of history at the University of Mary of North Dakota, where he's also a fellow in Catholic Studies. Dr. Stuart earned his PhD from the University of Edinburgh in 2009 in modern intellectual history and also holds degrees from the University of St. Andrews and the Franciscan University of Steubenville. Besides the book we're going to discuss today, Dr. Stuart is also the author of Christopher Dawson, A Cultural Mind in the Age of the Great War, published by Catholic University of America Press in 2022. We love Dawson around here, Joseph, if I can call you Joseph. And so,
Sure.
so I look forward to reading that book as well and hope to have you back on Acton Line to discuss it at some point.
That'd be wonderful.
So the book I really wanted to talk to you about is Rethinking the Enlightenment, Faith in the Age of Reason, which was published by Sophia Institute Press in 2020. When I was going through college in the late 80s and into the early 90s, at his kind of undergraduate work, we would only hear about the Enlightenment, never the plural. And then you encounter the complexity later on, as the Acton Institute likes to, we like to talk a lot about the Enlightenments and stress which ones are more Christian-friendly than the others and what that all means. But there still, I would say, is an overwhelming narrative about what the Enlightenment was. And I'm hoping we can get at that today. And I'd ask you my first question, which is, why do we need to rethink the Enlightenment? In other words, what's wrong with the way we tend to think about it? You and I would be outliers in this already, right? So what's wrong with the way we think about it? Another way to ask that would be to just ask you, what is the established view of the Enlightenment, and what needs to be corrected about it?
Yeah. Thank you, John. Thanks for having me on. Thanks for the great question. So, one of the problems that I noticed in my research on this topic was kind of an overgeneralization. Especially in kind of lay circles. Most historians nowadays recognize the Enlightenment was more complex than has been thought by many. But in lay circles, people who love history, but maybe haven't had a lot of formal training in it, and they'll speak of sort of the Enlightenment, right, or the Reformation, or sort of use titles like this to kind of, in a sweeping terms of a major historical movement. And I think that's fine. I mean, I use it in my rethinking the Enlightenment. I use it in my title, but that's sort of a concession to popular usage, right, to draw people in and say, okay, well, the reason we need to rethink it is because our overgeneralization actually obscures the truth of the past. And so we need to, instead of thinking of the Enlightenment as sort of this idea floating above history, right? We can sort of blame the philosophers for this. Hegel was the first to kind of create this idea of the Enlightenment that sort of floats above history. And then people pick it up, including historians and journalists and politicians and Catholic pundits and conservative writers. They pick up this idea of the Enlightenment in this kind of antithetical relationship, a dialectical relationship. We'll continue with Hegel's analogy here, with faith. Right, so it's sort of Enlightenment versus religion, and we can blame Hegel for this, but we can also blame Catholic historians and sort of a blinder to the full story of the past. Well, we're not, we don't blame them in the sense of, we understand, right? Because when a person goes through trauma, a person's memory is affected, and the Catholics went through trauma for sure, through the French Revolution and through Napoleon and the early 19th century. It was traumatic for Catholics. And part of the background to my argument is that trauma at a personal and at an institutional level sort of fragmented memory of what the full Enlightenment was. And so we sort of gripped onto this idea, who's the enemy? It's the Enlightenment. And it caused the French Revolution, which then attacked the church. And so then we get this dichotomous view in our modern understanding of the world as sort of religion versus secular. And so this immediately plays into a relevance in today's conversations about politics and culture and society today, because we project our polarity backward into the past. And so rethinking the past can help us rethink our own, a more nuanced, much more intelligent, sophisticated position in relation to our culture today.
Good historians know that history is about interpretation. And those of us who are not in the past, particularly the Enlightenment, and the farther back we go, the more this is true, we're interpreting the past using the data that we have, using the theories that we have, but applying those to real data, asking new questions of old evidence, old questions of new evidence. And I think that's a little bit of what you've done here. I wonder how you would fit this, the historiography you described of the Enlightenment just there, that we see in Peter Gay's Enlightenment book, which you take to task a little bit, that's published in 1966, where you get this sense that really Christians, especially Catholics, didn't have an Enlightenment, number one. And number two, it's strongly secular against Christianity, that's what the Enlightenment was. That was its essence. If we were to track backward a little bit and investigate the Renaissance and its view of, say, the classical world and whatever came in between, and then the Renaissance and our current views of the Renaissance, isn't there also something that we see there too, something similar? That is the whole time period of the medieval synthesis, what Christopher Dawson would have called just Christendom, that somehow this is where things went wrong, and things must be restored in some way. And it's often the sense that somehow reason is gone, but it's not reason they're restoring, is it? It's a very rigid empiricism in most cases. I guess if you could, apply that whole theory of progress and the Whig theory of history, and we're all becoming grown-ups, right? We're leaving our childhood in history and becoming grown-ups. Isn't there something bigger here, in other words, than just about how we interpret the Enlightenment? I mean, there's this kind of presentism, isn't there?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. And you can see it kind of on both sides of the interpretive spectrum, one of which is the Peter Gay side that you mentioned, which sort of says, Enlightenment versus Christianity bad, Enlightenment good, right? It's sort of the secular narrative. We're sort of leaving behind religion in the Dark Ages, and that plays into secularization theory and all kinds of things like that. And then the flip side of that is the Catholics and certain other Christians and conservatives who say, yeah, we agree. It's the Enlightenment versus Christianity, except in this case, it's the Enlightenment bad and Christianity good, right? So you reverse the valuation. And my argument is that this is a polarity that misses the actual nuance of the story of the Enlightenment, and so what we need to do is we need to go back in time, in a sense, which is what historical evidence allows us to do in part. We need to go back in time and look around in the 18th century for ourselves. We need to look around and say, okay, what's going on here? If I were to interview people on the street in 1760s London or Paris or Vienna, what do they think about this movement that maybe they don't use the word the Enlightenment yet, but it's something new. There's something in the air. There's people are drinking coffee, and there's coffee houses, and literally the lights are turning on in the cities, and the streets are being paved, and it's an exciting time. What do people think about this? Is this essentially an attack on religion? Is it not? And what my book is trying to do is find out what they say.
So when Christians engaged the Enlightenments, how did they do it? And we'll get to, I think, if we could talk about that for a moment, then let's specifically look at France, especially, and the Catholics in France, and people like Voltaire.
Yeah, that's great. And let me just link back to the historiography question here to answer that. So in the last 20 years, there's been a lot of new historical scholarship about the Enlightenment, which has really created a much more nuanced picture. So some have looked at it in terms of the national context. The French Enlightenment, very different than the British and American Enlightenments. Others have looked at it in terms of what's called the religious Enlightenment. David Sorkin at Yale, for example, just a wonderful book called The Religious Enlightenment. And since then, there's been a lot of scholarship on a specifically Catholic Enlightenment, particularly by people like Ulrich Lehner at Notre Dame, but a lot of people he knows, a lot of his friends have just pumping out books, and we're talking like Oxford University Press books about this idea of a Catholic Enlightenment. So there's been a major shift. This isn't me. This is just me picking up on other historians' great work and trying to synthesize it and bring it together for a wide audience. And so the shocking thing is is that what we have forgotten is that Christians engaged with the Enlightenment in very sophisticated ways. Very few of them condemned it outright. Many of them, the educated ones, really worked hard to engage the Enlightenment across Europe and even in Mexico and other places in North America. And so that's what we see. And so we have to think of the sort of different varieties, different kinds. And so how I divide the Enlightenment up is in sort of three kinds. One, the conflictual Enlightenment is what we normally think of it in France, Voltaire, and Rousseau, and definitely at odds with the church and Christianity in general, right? But then you have this Catholic Enlightenment, which is this part of this larger religious Enlightenment. And I go to Italy and Germany to talk about this reality in which you see a sophisticated kind of engagement with the Enlightenment. So conflict, yes, but also serious engagement. We can talk more about that. And then the third, just to finish that point, was the practical Enlightenment. And this is something that intellectual historians and philosophers sometimes forget, which is that the Enlightenment was not just an idea. It was a culture. It was a movement. It was an exciting time of technological change and innovation. And so we have to think about the Enlightenment not just in terms of Kant, but also in terms of somebody like Benjamin Franklin and various Benedictine monks who were inventing like the first electric motors and these sorts of things, very practical kinds of things. So the practical Enlightenment is the third.
So the practical Enlightenment, so the American representative I was thinking Franklin before you said Franklin, but that would have to be Benjamin Franklin then, right?
That's right.
That would be practicality in terms of government as well, wouldn't it?
That's right.
I think
That's right.
You cite that story in your book when Franklin is telling people about the Constitution after the convention is over and say, no, of course it's not perfect. And I'll paraphrase him, but the best possible polity is what we're trying to give you. You can't have perfection on earth.
Yeah. That's right. And that's the practical Enlightenment, intellectually speaking, which is really different than the more metaphysical conflictual Enlightenment in France, which was just sort of very utopian and opposed to Christianity. So yeah, that's exactly right.
Well, let's visit the Catholics before we get back to the conflictual then. I was taken with the story you told of Maria Agnesi, the Italian mathematician. And this was somebody with whom I was not too familiar. And there were a couple things worth noting about the story. And one was how well she was treated. Two, the respect she was given at the University of Bologna and by Pope Benedict XIV, the Enlightenment Pope, as you call him time and again in your book. But just comparing her experience in Italy to, say, the way enlighteners elsewhere, like Rousseau, treated women, that was a very, very interesting distinction between those two. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about Maria Agnesi and why we hear about the Scottish Enlightenment. We certainly hear about the French Revolution quite a bit, but you hardly ever hear the phrase Italian Enlightenment.
Yeah, that's great. Partly because I think the Italian Enlightenment was very connected to the Renaissance that you mentioned earlier, kind of continuing those themes, but also renewal within Catholicism, especially in Milan, that Charles Borromeo had brought about in the early 1600s. And that kind of renewal was a kind of renewal it's very different than sort of American Catholicism today. But Italian Catholicism is just much more eh, interested in engaging with the wider culture, and that's true today, and it was true back then. And so Maria Agnesi was educated by very smart clerics, like leading figures in mathematics, in physics, and she was studying Newton, but she also had a classical education. So she's bringing this all together, and came from a wealthy, devout family in Milan. And she's famous for being the first woman in history to write a mathematics textbook, at least under her own name. And so she was a brilliant mind, but she was also a great woman of faith. Her private chapel was right next to her private study with a door in between. So sort of this symbolic movement back and forth of faith and reason in her life and in this Catholic Enlightenment. And she would give salon conversations. So in the great drawing room of their family palace in Milan, many people, even from around Europe, would come to listen to her lecture and debate in Latin, or in 4 or 5 other languages, and of all kinds of questions. She would also spend a lot of her time on the streets helping women as a volunteer in local hospitals and things. She's just an amazing person. She would come home from volunteering in the hospital and change and get freshen up, right, and then sort of waltz into this drawing room for these high level debates, sort of like a superhero, changing costumes. She is just an amazing character, and so there's been recent scholarship done on her, and my students who read about her are just amazed and start wanting to write papers about her because she's so cool.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Now, is she? I guess what one should ask then, how distinctive was she then in Italy? And not simply as a woman, but as that kind of Enlightenment figure that's gathering disciples in the way, say, Voltaire did.
Yeah. So as a woman, I mean, there weren't a lot of women doing this, but there were even fewer in other places in Europe. And that was a thing about Italy, like in mostly coffee houses, for example, which was the new social institution of the 18th century, were men only in most of Europe, but not in Italy. It was possible for men and women to be mixing in these coffee houses. And so you have other examples. Piscopia, for example, in Venice, she was the first woman in history to earn a degree from a university. She was a lay Benedictine woman. And so you have this tradition of educated women taking inspiration from the Greek and Roman classic heroines, and also the Virgin Mary, taking inspiration, and their culture made space for them, sometimes grudgingly, but it made space. And what was unheard of in Europe was the institutional recognition that they achieved at universities and academies, particularly in Bologna, which was in the Papal States. And these women's careers were forwarded by the Pope himself. Like, he protected them from jealous male colleagues. And Laura Bassi was a great physicist, is the person who helped popularize Newton in Italy. She taught in Bologna. She had 8 kids, but she taught at the university, and she was eventually the highest paid professor at the institution. So this wasn't happening anywhere else in Europe. You have very smart women in other places, but you don't have the kind of institutional recognition that you do here in Italy.
Let's look at a different experience for Catholics now. So you pointedly are highly critical of those Catholics in France, particularly in France, who contributed to the ill will and sentiments against the church that resulted in violence and sacrilege during the French Revolution. I remember as a professor, I'd often spend time talking about the damage done to the churches in France, and the orgies and the tearing out of the tabernacle and the worshiping of the goddess Liberty, etc. The smashing of biblical kings, thinking they're the kings of France on the sides of the cathedral, etc. But I think many Americans, at least, especially Catholic integralists and traditionalist Catholics, they're very familiar with the Reformation of Henry VIII, the events described by Eamon Duffy in his groundbreaking study, The Stripping of the Altars, of the bloody reign of the English Queen Elizabeth I, with the priest holes and the executions and the penal laws, and ultimately William of Orange in the celebration of his battlefield victories with bonfires and flute band parades, even to this day. But you tell a tale, which I had to laugh a little bit when I saw Dungeons and Dragoons in your book side by side. I had to read it 3 times to make sure I knew what that you weren't talking about the role-playing game, but these Catholic dragons and the revocation of the Edict of Nantes in order to explain the excesses of the French Revolution. It's kind of the flip side, I think, of a story that American Catholics are used to, where only the Protestant fanatics are the bad guys and the Catholics are the victim. Maybe can you elaborate on that tale?
Yeah, that's a good way to put it, John. It wasn't just the Protestants who were fanatics; they were Catholic fanatics too, and this was a major problem, because in a way, the odd man out in this Enlightenment story is France. In much of Europe, you have this religious enlightenment. You have a lot of religious figures who, at a high level, are engaging the modern sciences, Newton, even modern political ideas. You have that happening. But for some reason, what happened in France has sort of flavored our whole memory of the Enlightenment ever since. And so the question really is, why in France was there this incredible polarity develop between the French Revolution and the Church, but even before that, between these what were called philosophes, which is, I don't use that term because it's a biased French term, but I'll use it in the French context. This dichotomy between the philosophes and religion. So where did this come from? And it's really odd, actually, too, John, if you think about it, because France was long the eldest daughter of the church. She was known as this, very faithful, Catholic country. And so why does this radical movement come out of it? It's a very strange puzzle. And Granted, there are many different ways that you could try to answer this question. In history, there's never just one cause of anything. It's right, the principle of complexity in historical thinking, right? But the one that I really wanted to focus on was the one that's most uncomfortable for us, for Catholics at least, and that is Catholic sin, is what I call it, and bad political thinking too. And what happened in France is you have this monarch rise up through absolute monarchy, who is sort of inspired by this kind of integralist idea of sort of joining church and state in a very close and tight relationship, right? He would work. I mean, he had a spiritual advisor. He had good relationships with leading bishops, and they were going to work together to create this French and very Catholic nation. And so they passed a law, which essentially made it illegal to be a Protestant. You could privately, in your conscience, be a Protestant, but you couldn't publicly worship. And so this was called the Edict of Nantes, had given them religious freedom. So the revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1685 undid that. And this, and to enforce this law through the dragons or the dragoons, the French light cavalry, would fan out across the country and basically terrorize the population. And many bishops would invite the dragons into their diocese in order to carry out their work. And the Protestants began to flee. Now, the official belief was there weren't really many left in France anyway, so it didn't really matter. But events proved otherwise.
Now, who was promoting the official belief?
Yeah,
I mean, who was telling the king that look, there's not many Huguenots anyway, so.
Yeah, no, that. Well, I mean, his close advisors. I mean, it was sort of one of those convenient lies that supported the policy that the church and the state wanted to have, right? So his closest advisors. So the king was believing this, and I think a lot of his the upper level churchmen, I think, believed it too. There weren't a lot left because on paper it looked like the whole realm was Catholic, but that's part of the problem with enforcing faith, is that on paper it looks one way, but in reality it's another way, and you create a reaction. And so as people are fleeing the country, the government realized, holy smokes, a lot of our best citizens are leaving the country. We better close the borders. So France became a prison for people that wanted to escape for freedom of conscience, and then the persecution unfolds. And the basic idea here is that this persecutory state it then becomes a weapon used during the French Revolution against Catholics themselves, right? So once you yield to this kind of Catholic political correctness, and you abuse other people's consciences, then it's not just a personal sin; it's also sort of a political sin, and you create the very machinery that will later be used against you. And that's exactly what happened, and that's the background, I think, to this resentment and this deep conflict, not just in France, but that is spread after the French Revolution around Europe into our own modern mentality to this day.
Yeah, you even call it a superstition in the book that so twisted their faith that they couldn't look at their Huguenot neighbor and see the Imago Dei. They could only see something that ought to be massacred or driven out or compelled. So this misuse of the compulsion which
That's right.
You quote Saint Jose Maria Escrivá in the book, and C.S. Lewis, and all this exegesis about what that compulsion means and how it was twisted, and even that term political correctness I thought was interesting, interesting to use there for France.
Yeah, it completely was. We're used to thinking of political correctness as something like the left or the progressivists do today. Well, there's political correctness within Catholic cultures too, and a superstition is exactly what it was, because it is superstitious to sacralize political authority, because that's putting too much weight. It's too utopian. It's putting too much weight on sort of what's a worldly kind of reality. And Jesus, clearly said Caesar and God are not the same thing. And when you get that confused, it creates major problems in your country and even in modern history itself.
Yeah, you quote the Caesar quote, right? Render therefore to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. So your render under Caesar, when Caesar acts like or claims to be God, is going to stretch the state to the point that if we do obey it, then we're denying God. So one of the things I think that the church was successful at for centuries was taking the state of ancient Rome, where the emperor was worshipped as a god, where the state was divine in essence because the state was installed in this person, and desacralizing it. And so this move that you're describing, amid the Enlightenment and in conflict with the Enlightenment, but really leading to it, not resulting from it. I think maybe that's the key. I mean, this is what. So when we study the history, it's not that this doesn't cause the understanding and mentality that the church has in the 19th century. That is a result of all those condemnations of liberalism, et cetera, that we get from Pius IX and Gregory XVI, et cetera, in the 19th century. Those are the result of looking at how bloody democracy is in France and the many revolutions and the revolutions of 1848. But when you start tracing cause and effect, we can keep going back quite a bit. So that you take it back before the Enlightenment, so the Enlightenment doesn't get all the blame. Everybody is. There's a lot of people who are responsible for this sin. So to re-divinize the state takes the church away from its real mission, which is evangelization. And you point out pretty well in the book, you can't evangelize this way. And so here's the result. Right? You see the result. Maybe the worst result you describe in the book was the murder of the Carmelites on the scaffold. And I think it's very good literature, actually, Joseph, the way you describe it in tandem with Voltaire and his death. I should say his many deaths. Some fake, one real. I thought that was a strange thing. But why did you choose to kind of hold up Voltaire on one end of this axis and the Carmelites on the other in this death scene?
Yeah, that's a good question. I've actually never been asked that question. So it's the part one of the book is on this conflictual enlightenment. It's based in France. And you're right, that the main characters that kind of frame part one of the book are the Carmelites of Compiègne, great, just incredible martyrs and figures of the faith, and Voltaire as this symbol of this conflict. And so I think the reason I wanted to sort of juxtapose them was partly because the conflict is seen in their approaches to religion. Yes, that's part of it. But also because it's not as if one is good and one is bad completely. I mean, the nuns they're martyrs, so they're good. But Voltaire is a complex figure, and he himself had been working for justice. He became sort of a human rights kind of activist who was trying to end this persecutory regime that I was talking about earlier. And I think he was largely and well justified in many of the things, his critiques of that context that he was in. And so I've tried to build up a sympathetic picture of Voltaire, and then a really sympathetic picture of the nuns. And they're both approaching their death, which of course are in different years. Voltaire is dying in 1778 and the nuns in 1794. But I thought, outside of time, their deaths are happening simultaneously, if we thought of it that way. And so to juxtapose their deaths with a little passage from Voltaire as he's dying, and then a little passage describing the nuns as they're dying, and going back to would help to spiritually show what's happening. because Voltaire, while he was a sympathetic figure, in some ways, one of his major flaws and major problems was the deep sort of individualism at the heart of his thought, and his rebellion against the church, although maybe reconciled at the end, we're not sure. But the point is that his very individualistic philosophy plays out in his own death, which is that he dies alone, in agony, abandoned by even his mistress at the end, and even his nurses. And so as you're watching that, you're watching a certain kind of philosophy without God and what it leads to. And at the same time, you're seeing this philosophy of following God closely as martyrs, dying as a community together, so not alone, and also peacefully, because these sisters were singing on their way to the guillotine. And so trying to that spiritual contrast.
Yeah. And not only peacefully, you describe one of the sisters asking her mother superior for permission. Yeah. That this recognition that her life is not her own. That people are not objects, including you yourself, right? And I thought that was a very powerful, heart-wrenching moment describing that martyrdom in your book. So Voltaire suffers from what I think Kant and Paine suffered from, and this is that radical view of themselves as autonomous, which is
that's right.
Which is, I think, evinces this anthropology that rejects the classical wisdom that man is a social animal, number one, and that thought and action have an ethical connection, that you can't just separate so. And it rejects Augustine's insight that our minds are restless until they rest in God, and rejects, I would say, the scholastic synthesis of that recognize the unity of truth and that you can approach it by many means, and not just by reason alone, but certainly through more than only those things which we can empirically measure and sift through and gauge. And that seems to me the underlying principle in all the secular enlighteners is that faulty anthropology and what it can lead to. And I think you do see it in Robespierre's terror, which he praised as virtuous in his diatribe against his enemies during the Reign of Terror.
That's right.
Now, what do you make of John Paul II and Fides et Ratio talking about people like Voltaire, saying, even those who separated faith from reason somehow could still have insights worth noting and could still propel us forward in thinking more deeply about how faith and reason interact.
Yeah, he's right. He's absolutely right. And it's an insight that Newman, I think, sensed too in Newman's own on development of doctrine book. If you read carefully toward the beginning, he talks about the ways that ideas develop, and they often develop through different people, very different views, conflict, and sort of the dust of life that gets into the air. And it's when you're in it, it feels awful, and it seems like there's these enemies that you just want to kill them. It feels like at the moment, but in reality, you're locked in this titanic struggle. And as the dust settles, with enough time, and you realize, holy smokes, I wasn't all right, and they weren't all wrong. And I think you can see that in someone like Voltaire, for sure. I mean, I was really struck, John, writing this book, and you read Voltaire's treatise on toleration, and certain parts of it read very much like Dignitatis Humanae of Vatican II, and the importance of religious freedom. And I mean, Voltaire talks about how Jesus was gentle; he didn't try to force people to follow him, and the bishops at Vatican II said the same thing. And so there's eerie kind of echo across the ages that linked a lot of Voltaire's insights to later truths that Catholics have sort of just take for granted now.
Yeah, that's when C.S. Lewis says that the hardness of God is kinder than the softness of men. Yes. Joseph, this has been a pleasant conversation. I'd like to bring us up to the present to close out our Acton Line interview on your book, Rethinking the Enlightenment, Faith in the Age of Reason. What lessons should we take today, particularly, I would say, from the Catholic role in really the conflictual Enlightenment in France? That is the Catholic role in the face of, on the one hand, we have the woke mob. And recently I read, I thought a really good definition of woke by Robert George, calling it, quote, the attitude of a person who regards his or her opinions as so obviously correct and so profoundly enlightened, there's the word enlightened, that they may not legitimately be doubted or challenged, and that only hate or bigotry can explain others holding different beliefs, end quote. So you have that on the one hand, and then on the other hand, government-enforced gender ideology that contradicts both faith and reason. So what is the Catholic, indeed, what are all Christians to do? The post-liberals, the Catholic integralists advocate for an integralist state and state capitalism. I think in their own way, but in a different way, national conservatives do as well. You can certainly understand the temptation to wield state power on behalf of the faith and common sense, etc. So what is your cure for what ails our whole society, Joseph? It's up to you, a mere historian, to help us out here. But what lessons can we glean from the entire Enlightenment experience that might help us navigate this?
Good, thank you. No, I'll just try to two last thoughts here. So the first is just the importance of history, of good history, and partly to kind of settle us down in our theoretical kind of hot-headedness, and to say, okay, look, your ideas come from somewhere, and so do mine. If we understand the roots of that, we'll understand the questions that were originally motivating them, that were behind them. And so then our ideas become not just sort of these free-floating things, like Hegel would say, sort of in conflict with each other anymore, but rather they're related to a particular community and a particular time. And if you understand that, it just inculcates a certain kind of humility and realism in them. And even if you don't agree with somebody, trying to understand where their thinking is coming from. So good history is essential to be at least in the background for our more theoretical discussions that we like to have in our present political age. So that's one lesson, I think. And I think the history of the 18th century is particularly important because that is a time when people were trying to deal with different ideological positions, and they had codes of conduct and free speech, and the idea that you should be able to come into a coffee house and talk with people of very different kinds and enjoy the very hot coffee served in dishes back then, in sort of bowls almost, and then have that kind of conversation. So I think that good history and that freedom of conversation is one point I'll end with. And then the second and last point is really the overall takeaway from my book, I hope, which is that Christians interacted with their modern Enlightenment culture in three ways in the 18th century: through conflict, through conflicting with that environment, through engaging that environment, and through sort of retreating from it, which we didn't talk a lot about in this interview. But the third strategy was retreating from it and just sort of letting it happen. You do your thing and I'll do mine. We would maybe call that the Benedict option today in its positive best sense, right? And my argument is that we need all three of those. We need all three. In our narrowness, we like to think one of them is the only proper response. Wrong. People have different vocations. Different institutions have different. Acton has its own vocation in a sense, but a Catholic university or Catholic charities might have a different kind of vocation. Appreciating that there are people who are really good at conflict, maybe lawyers, maybe other people who are good at engagement, professors and journalists and whoever, and other people who are really good at retreat. And we need all three strategies to have a healthy relationship to the modern world and to help the kingdom of God thrive. And I think that's what we need.
And thank you, Joseph. And you would argue then that these are lessons to be gleaned from the Enlightenment. We don't want to go into gleaning too many lessons from history, of course, in the old-fashioned sense in which most historians would criticize that. But certainly, I would say the same thing about the American founding. Before we put up a straw man and call it liberalism and strike it down and blame everything on 1776 or pick another year, 1619, like the 1619 Project, we have to learn to manage the complexity of history, the good and the bad, the perfect with the imperfect, what people say versus what they do. And when the bad people unintentionally bring about good things, Lord Acton talks about this in his histories quite a bit. These things happen, and so this is why a historical grounding, I think, is important to all these discussions. The difficulty comes in arguing, in the best sense of the word, with those who don't argue back. I think in some ways that's our current challenge. If we argue past each other, we're still not engaging in a conversation, and that's increasingly difficult to do, I would say, given the technological social media landscape.
That's when we need to figure out how to garden together and go out and volunteer together for homeless people and help it. If you can't talk, let's at least do together.
Yeah, right. I don't, except for a couple of my neighbors because I know them well, I don't really know their politics. We do things like take care of the neighborhood, take care of the lake, argue about what day to hold a picnic in the neighborhood, just neighborly things that are a good example of Tocquevillian associative life. And we don't talk politics because we don't really have to. We all have to drive over the same potholes, though.
That's right. That's right.
Subsidiarity in action, I guess.
That's right.
So, Dr. Joseph Stuart, professor of history at the University of Mary and author of Rethinking the Enlightenment, Faith in an Age of Reason, and author most recently of Christopher Dawson, A Cultural Mind in the Age of the Great War. I want to thank you very much for being on Acton Line. I appreciate our conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. Thank you so much.
Yeah. This is Dr. John Pinheiro. Thank you.
As always, thank you for listening. Our team loves putting this podcast together for you. It's encouraging to hear from our listeners. Feedback is incredibly important to us because it lets us know what you'd like to hear more of, including the kinds of topics you're interested in most. If you have comments, feedback, or ideas for a show topic or interesting guest, you can email our team at producer@acton.org. Until next week, for Acton Line, I'm Eric Cohn.